All right, so let's try some proofs. There are some examples on page 340 of proofs that you can do. So let's look. Let's try number 8. So this is page 340, question 8. Now, remember, each line has a proposition on it, and then you write how you know that proposition is true, and for the premises, you just write premise. So 2, is that a J? Yes, J then K. And then, because there's only 2 premises, on the second premise line, you do a slash, and you write the conclusion. And I like to write it in a different color to remind myself I don't actually have this yet. This is just what I'm trying to get. All right. That's how you begin. Now, the hardest part of any proof is the next line. What the hell do I do now, you ask yourself. Well, this is where I have 2 strategies. On the handout of proofs that I talked about earlier, I call these the bottom-up and top-down strategy. The bottom-up strategy I also call the stumbling forward blindly method. And what that is you just look, you ignore the conclusion, and you just look and see if there's something that you can do with the premises. Now, when I say something, I don't mean, and I mentioned this before, I don't mean, for example, addition, because you can always do addition to anything. But very rarely is it useful, because you could be adding on anything, and that wouldn't necessarily be useful to you down the road. But what the kind of thing I mean is specifically 6 of the 7 syllogisms in the first set of rules. And the one that is also not necessarily very useful is conjunction. Because obviously I could do conjunction here. I could just take this line, write it here, stick an and there, and write this line there. But what does that help me? It probably hasn't helped me. So, I mean like modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, hypothetical syllogism, those kind of things. And of course, if you can do one of the dilemmas, that's great, but that comes up more rarely. So, there is something I can do in this case. Can you see what it is? Can you see which of the syllogisms would work here? Well, notice that the consequent of this one is the same as the antecedent of this one. Remember, that will allow us to do hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 2. The J's cancel, and you have the antecedent of the first one, which is G and H, then the consequent of the second one. You got that. Okay, that is as far as my stumbling forward blindly will get me. In this case, sometimes you will stumble forward blindly and you'll get the conclusion. And you'll say, okay, I've reached something. Hey, it happens to be the conclusion. But probably in most cases, you have to also employ what I call the top-down method, or working backwards from the conclusion. So let's call this SFB for stumbling forward blindly, and working backwards from the conclusion. WBC. I'm not sure if that helps at all, but there you go. Those are nice little 3-letter acronyms. Okay. Now, what do I mean working backwards from the conclusion? Well, you look at the conclusion and you ask yourself, how am I going to get that out of the premises? Well, it's got a G, a K, and an H. Here's the G and the H, and here's the K. So clearly you're going to have to combine these two. Well, we already have. We've done that. Now we've got the G and the H and the K. So there, the three letters in line 3 are already the three letters involved in the conclusion. But we've got G alone as the antecedent, and we've got the K in the middle. Okay, so we're going to have to do something to this. Is there something that we can do to this that will put G out front as a conditional? And there is, and it's my second favorite rule of equivalence. See if you can see what rule will do that. It is exportation. And we're going to do exportation on line 3. Now, what will that give us? It will give us if G, then if H, then K. Okay, good. So now we've got the first part of the conclusion set, but now we have to turn this into this. So we've got to change a conditional into an or, we've got to get a tilde in the H, and we've got to change the order. That's going to be possible in 2 steps. Let's change the condition. We're only going to be applying a rule of equivalence to this, so we leave this the same. What rule of equivalence changes a conditional to an or? It's my first favorite rule of equivalence. It's implication, otherwise known as the Arrowsmith rule. So if you remember, if you're changing a conditional to an or, there are 2 steps. First, you flip the sign from a conditional to an or vice versa. Then you negate the one on the left. The one on the right remains unchanged. So that's implication line 4. Then one more thing, we've got the tilde H, we've got the K, they're just in the wrong order. Well, there's a rule that allows us to flip the order when the connective is an or. Can you remember what that is? It is commutation. Commutation, line 5, gets us the conclusion. Okay, that one, I don't want to say it was particularly tricky, but there it was. Okay, let's do question 17 as another one. A and B or C, if C then D, because these are premises. If A then not B, and that's a premise, and then the conclusion is D. Okay. Okay, remember, we have the 2 strategies, stumbling forward blindly or working backwards from the conclusion. So, here is there something that immediately springs to mind? Well, we can't do any hypothetical syllogisms, we can't do any modus ponens, we can't do a hypothetical syllogism because neither of these matches up, there's no overlap. We can't do any modus ponens, we can't do any disjunctive syllogisms, so nothing obvious springs to mind. So we're not going to be stumbling forward blindly. Let's do working backwards from the conclusion. First thing to notice is the conclusion is D. So obviously we're going to use line 2 to get the conclusion. And in fact, so line 2 is if C then D, and we want to end up with the conclusion D. What rule is that, and what is the missing premise? The rule, I think, as should be obvious, is modus ponens. And if we're going to do modus ponens, we need C. Okay, so what that tells us is, in order to get D, we need first to get C. Where can we get C from? Well, we're not going to get it out of line 2 because we're going to use it with line 2. So there has to be another place that we get C from, and it's line 1. Okay, so line 1 gives us A and B or C, and we want to end up with C. Is there a rule that does that? And if so, what's the missing premise? And I think it's clear that there is a rule. It's disjunctive syllogism because this is a disjunction. And what we need is the negation of this. We need not A and B. So now, in order to get C, we need not A and B. Or Well, actually, yes, that one should be fairly easy to get. Because we then say, okay, how are we going to get not A and B? And we don't get it out of that line because we're going to use it with that line, so we have to get it out of this line. And in fact, this line is equivalent to not A and B. So by one rule of equivalence, we can turn this line into not A and B. Actually, let's take 2 steps. Because what we're going to do is we're going to do implication to line 3. And let's just follow the rules that I gave you for implication just to the letter. So the rules were, first of all, negate the one on the right. So this is not B, so it becomes not B. Because let's just stick an extra tilde on there, what we mean by negating. Then you switch the symbols, so this is a conditional and becomes an and then you negate the whole thing. So you put parentheses around the whole thing and negate it. Remember, there are 3 steps when you're converting between a conditional and an ampersand. Okay, good. That's almost what we want, except we want to get rid of those 2 tildes. What do we use? We use the tidy up rule, double negation on line 4. So the only part that we apply it to is here. Everything else in the line stays the same, it's just we get rid of those 2 tildes. Now we've got this. Why did we want this? Oh, so that we could do disjunctive syllogism with line 1. So disjunctive syllogism 1 and 5. It's A and B or C. Well, it's not A and B, so it is C. Okay, so we've got C. Why did we want C? Oh, that's right, because we wanted to use C with this line. If C and D, if C, then D, C, conclusion D, by modus ponens, lines 2 and 6. And Bob's your uncle. There we have the conclusion of that little argument. So you can see how these arguments work. And there's going to be some simple little arguments in the homework. And there's going to be some longer arguments. Practice makes perfect, or at least slightly better. So get practicing.